Thank you for joining us today. It's great to be with you. I'm Doug Duncan, the President and CEO of Leadership Greater Washington. I want to welcome you to another in our series of Frontline Conversations, talking with people who are dealing with the daily events that are happening all around us. And David, it's an honor to welcome you here. David is the VP and Market Leader, Mid-Atlantic for Enterprise Community Partners. He's also been a anti-violence leader, a leader for nonviolence, for at least 2 decades now, and is quite a leader in the Washington, D.C. region. Dave, we've got a great crowd for you there. We have people from across the country, and we've got at least one from Africa tuning in. So congratulations to you on that. You're reaching around the world today. Let me just start off by asking, how are you doing? How are you doing personally? How are you handling all this, this uproar, the illness and the unrest and everything else?
Doug, first of all, thank you. It's good to see everyone, it's everyone who's on the line from all over the world. Kudos to folks in Africa, the motherland, and anywhere you may be. And I would say to all my fellow LGW classmates and participants who are on the line, we hope you're feeling fine, but there's nothing like primetime 09. So we welcome you all here. Thanks for asking, Doug. How I'm feeling is a combination of angry and frustrated and also hopeful and encouraged. And so on a just a human level, you feel the despair and the anger, obviously at the killing of Mr. Floyd and others, right, who we've seen yet again. And so whenever you see that kind of senseless taking of life, you're just angry. There's a sense of being tired, right? And you hear this, I heard this with Dr. Wesley on Friday's session, which was great. That same notion, you just get tired of the same old, and it just kind of, here we go again. And so it is draining, and it is stressful also on a different level. As an African-American man, there's a level of stress, and you'll hear people talk about that. And I remember with the coronavirus, even before Mr. Floyd was killed, the coronavirus, I was walking in my neighborhood trying to, get out and about and walk. And so when we started kind of wearing masks, right, I was wearing masks. I remember literally I had 3 or 4 friends, just independent of each other, said to me, oh, by the way, be careful. Because, they were like, hey, you're a big black man walking through the neighborhoods in Ward 3 and you're wearing a mask and you tend to walk towards the, evening hours, sunset hours. So they literally were just like, be careful. And so, that becomes stressful and draining. What I'm encouraged about is obviously what we see in terms of the activism, the reactions of people, the fact that some actions have taken place in quick order, the firing of the police officers, suspension of police officers or dismissal of police officers in places like from Atlanta to Fairfax County, Virginia, what we just saw recently. So the fact that you see in some ways some actions taking place is encouraging. The level of activism is encouraging and hopeful in this and prayerful in the sense of you hope it lasts, that there'll be some staying power from all of us, right, in all different ways that I know we'll talk more about.
So just staying with the personal for a second, we are at a very unique, interesting, disturbing, stressful time in American history. We've got COVID, which has affected the minority community in a much greater proportion than others. We've got the economic depression that we're in. We now have this righteous unrest that I've been talking about throughout the country and indeed throughout the world. And we've got climate change still going on. So there's 4 major things causing stress around the world right now. How are you dealing with the stress that you mentioned earlier? How are you dealing with that on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah, so it's a combination of literally kind of prayer and devotion time, really working to start every day with just some quiet time of reading the Bible, prayer, just some quiet reflection. Practicing some breathing tips, exercises that heard a couple of mental health professionals on different sessions talk about the importance of that. So doing that is important. The self-care, the walking, trying to get out and move around, get outside, get fresh air each day has been an important part. staying connected with friends and family through things like Zoom or phone calls or text has been also important to me. And so, there's a group of guys who I've known for a long time, and we used to get together about once a quarter, right, together just to break bread in person. Well, that doesn't happen now, but when COVID started, one of the guys who's actually now living outside the country started doing a weekly Zoom call, right? And so the ability to connect and fellowship with folks has been important. Then another last thing I'll say, just in terms of for me personally, in terms of mental health, what I have found in my life, it reminds me of what my grandmother said: you sleep good at night when you live right, right? And so for me, the extent to which I feel like I'm doing what I'm supposed to be doing helps me actually rest. And I know when I'm not, when I'm off the game, when I'm a little bit lazy, when I'm not really doing as much as I feel like I should be doing, I'm called to do, I get restless, I get anxious, right? I'm not as comfortable. So I can I can gauge pretty directly when I'm doing what I'm supposed to be doing or not, because when I'm not, it literally, there's an angst to me. So so in some ways, the way I get rest is do the work.
So you mentioned your daily devotion. You mentioned very much this sort of the spiritual aspect of how you're dealing with this, and sort of, we're looking to you for guidance. We're looking to you for your thoughts. We want to amplify your voice through this conversation today. So spiritually, what kind of advice do you recommend for us in terms of getting through this whole this crisis that we're in right now, of police brutality, of, as Al Sharpton said, get your knees off our necks. It's been going on for 400 years.
Yeah.
How are you dealing with that?
Yeah. So Doug, thinking about this conversation made me really think about, obviously, the issue around racism in America, right? And specifically, and as I talk through this, there are isms, schisms against all kinds of people. I always say that if in America, if you're kind of, a white, a WASP male, you start there, and everyone else is catching some degree of hell: females, blacks, Latinas, Native Americans, Asian Pacific Islanders, right, in the history of this country. So for the purposes of this conversation, I'm going to be referring to really kind of anti-Black racism, right, specifically. So in thinking about that, for me, there's a spiritual bucket, a legal policy bucket, and an operational policy bucket. And so in the spiritual realm, particularly, I think that we have to think about the fight against racism really first and foremost in the spiritual plane, that it really is a battle. Think about the writings of Paul to the church at Ephesus, saying that we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers, and talking about the need to put on the whole armor of God. This is really, and I'm speaking from my own kind of faith orientation, but just looking at history, I think regardless of what you believe, there are evil forces, right, in the hearts and minds of men and women that would allow someone to keep their knee on another human being's neck as that person is dying, and for almost 3 minutes after that person is clearly dead, and to be able to look coldly into a camera, that's an evil. That's a spiritual kind of evil going on. To chase down and shoot a man, right, like Mr. Arbery. An unarmed man out for a jog, right? There's a level of evil there. The spirits of evil and greed and avarice and self-interest that would have led Europeans to enslave Africans and their descendants, forcing them to toil for no compensation, raping Black women, castrating Black men, making it illegal for them to read, and lynch them as a form of punishment and terror. To define Blacks as 3/5 of a man and some of the documents, the founding kind of documents of this country, to create that pseudoscience that even created the construct of race and the definitions that favored one group over another. So for me, that's just in the American context. And if you talk about the extermination of Native Americans here, genocide in Rwanda or Bosnia, the burning of Jews by the Germans, humanity from the dawn of time has dealt with evil, right? The battle of evil versus good. And so to me, there is a spiritual component that requires prayer for evil to either be transformed, right? Prayer, fasting, education, conversation, or to, again, using an example from my own faith orientation, to run it away, the way Jesus ran the evil demons into the swine, right? Get out that man and go into the swine, and then they jump into the river for a man called Legion. So last thing I'll say on this, I think in the spiritual realm is we have to ask the question that I think that Jesus asked the man at the pool called Bethesda, which is, do you want to be well? Right? There was a man sitting at a pool, waiting to be put in the waters. 38 years had been sick, never got in the water, stayed broken. And Jesus asked the guy, look, do you want to be well? That is a question for our country that on some level, before we get the legal stuff, before we get the operational stuff, there's a gut check kind of spiritual, mental question of, do we want to be well or not? For America as a country, for white Americans in particular, when we talk about dealing with anti-Black racism, and if the answer is yes, then we got to get up and walk. The way Jesus told them, man, get up. Stop waiting for something else over there. You get up. You start moving and get to the work that needs to be done. And he told the man, and sin no more. So for me, as I deal with this, as I process through this, as we're struggling with all of this, there again, we'll talk more, I know, about legal and other policy issues, but on a fundamental level, we have to pray and reflect, I think, and deal with that aspect of it, or else we'll be missing.
So to become well, you first have to acknowledge that you're not well, that you're sick. And you think America is ready to acknowledge that? And we have leaders, our national leaders, saying there's nothing wrong here, everything's fine. Just a couple of bad apples in a couple of police departments, and that's it. There's no such thing as systemic racism. That was all fixed in the 1950s, 1960s, with the integration of the military and with the civil rights movement. I don't believe that. I think we are dealing with systemic racism. I think it's worse now than it has been in some time. And so are we ready to get well? Are we ready to admit that we're sick as a people, as a nation?
I think that the answer is mixed. I think there are those in the country, and I think there are white Americans who have benefited from racism who want to be well, who are acknowledging that, hey, something's wrong here with this country. This is not right. As they learn more, get exposed to more, when they see things like the killing of Mr. Floyd. And I think it's important to talk about not the death of Mr. Floyd, but the killing of Mr. Floyd. I think there are people who say, yeah, we are sick. And I think that's part of this moment, that people are seeing kind of how sick we are as a nation. So I do think, and I've heard I've heard from friends and colleagues who are white who have reached out, and stories of other Black friends who've heard from whites who say, hey, something's wrong here. We got to fix this. We got to get right. But then there are others who don't, right? And so I like to use the analogy of, in terms of physical health and everything. I say, sometimes you just want to be kind of fat and happy sitting on the couch watching the game, eating a steak. You don't want to get up and do running for 5 miles. I don't want to eat the salad. I'm happy in this box. And so there are those who clearly are in that space. I'm okay here. We're okay here. There's nothing wrong with me, being like this. And so again, I think that the combination of legal approaches, educational approaches, operational approaches, and spiritual approaches to helping people understand something is wrong with this. This is not an okay place to be. And it didn't happen accidentally or one-off, that there is a system that has led to this over time.
But do you think this time is different? I mean, the crowds that are marching, the crowds that are protesting, I think are very different than they've been in the past, in terms of the diversity within the marchers or between the marchers. But is this something that we'll do and then people go back to work and then we just sort of move on and forget about it? How do we make this more of a lasting kind of approach?
Yeah, here's a classic Washington, D.C. answer, Doug. Yes, it's different, and yes, people are going to go back to the way things were, right? I think both things are true. When Dr. King talked about the arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice, I think this is an inflection point. I think that it is bending, right? This is a sharp bend in terms of, I do believe that because of a convergence of things and not the killing of Mr. Floyd, the video from the woman in New York, just a number of things. The spirit of activism, right, of Black Lives Matter and other groups. I do think this is going to be different in terms of evolution of progress, but I don't think that we're going to fix everything, you know, in 12 months and then we move on. It's just that I don't believe that's going to happen. I wish it would, but I don't believe it will, because yes, some people are going to go back. So what I say to people is, when was the last time you talked about Freddie Gray? When was the last time you talked about Trayvon Martin? When was the last time Rodney King? Fill in the blank, right, of the names of wrong that has been done. And so whether you're a news station or whether you're an activist, quote unquote, or anything in between. So yeah, some people are going to lose focus. They're going to, you know, we're an ADD society. So I do think that that is part of the battle, right? And so the other piece is that I think we have to, in the same way, using the health analogy, do you want to be well? In the same way, I tell people, you need to shower. I said, well, you got to shower, brush your teeth every day. We need to exercise kind of on a regular. It's the same thing. The steps that it takes to be healthy as a nation, to be healthy as individuals, and then as a nation, as a democracy, they aren't a one and done thing. You don't do it. I don't brush my teeth today and then I'm good. My teeth are clean. I have to work at it daily, right? And so I think that's part of it, is that at some level, there are interventions, right? Using the teeth analogy, I had to get braces when I was a kid. That's a hardcore intervention. But then there's regular maintenance that has to take place. So this is a moment, I think, of intervention, right? Where we try to put something in America to turn that stuff around, right? Readjust, realign, right? The teeth are crooked or messed up. But then we've got to also do daily cleaning, right? Daily maintenance in order to make this thing happen.
How do you do an intervention in a case like you saw in Buffalo, where two police officers knocked a 75-year-old man, pushed him to the ground, he hit his head on the concrete, split his head open, got a concussion, in the hospital, and the police filed a report that he tripped.
Yeah.
No mention of being pushed. And then when the officers were taken to court, and as they came out of court, you had 100 police officers and other public safety personnel applauding them and supporting them for their actions. To me, that is a real symbol of the depths that we're going to have to go to fix this. And
yeah.
What kind of intervention would work in that situation, if at all?
Yeah, well, so it's interesting, because then it's a combination, I think, of on an operational side, there have to be policies in place, right? That say, for example, the people have been talking about, you got to get rid of the qualified immunity for police officers in excessive force cases. So some of the protections that are in place from an operational policy standpoint need to be addressed. There needs to be training better. You know, there's training that needs to take place about how do you engage? What's the proper way to engage? So that folks know this is not right. So again, that's an operational policy kind of piece. But then to me, there's also, when I talk about the prayer and the spiritual side, there's also for us as people to say, what's the normative standard, right? Of how are we going to engage with one another as human beings? Right? You say, that ain't right, right? That's just not right. And so we have to kind of move in our conversations on individual levels with one another to say to persons at my dinner table, at my boardroom table, at my fraternity table, at my union meeting, hey gang, this is not right. We can't operate like this. And so whether it is addressing the strength of, and I used to work at a union shop, I want to be clear, right? Pay dues and stuff. So it's like whether you are addressing the strength of a police union to say, just, you know, they got to deal with that, to the qualified immunity policy, to we have to be able to talk to one another and say, this ain't right. And all of that's got to come together. And again, for me, understanding, coming from the orientation I come from, I also recognize that at some point, right, that will address some of that, but sometimes there are going to be folks who just do wrong, right, who just do wrong, and then they must be held accountable.
But what's different nowadays is if you do wrong, you're very likely to have it be recorded on a cell phone, on a smartphone. Mm-hmm. And if you look at these cases, so the man being pushed down, you know, knocking himself out, or being knocked out as he hit the ground. The Arbery case being killed for jogging. If there weren't video of that, people would have looked at the police report and just said, okay, no problem, everything's fine. He tripped and wasn't anybody's fault. And I think that has been so powerful over these last few months to have that video evidence that is making police fill out more honest police reports, hopefully.
Yeah.
And bringing the attention of the public onto these things. I mean, to look at that George Floyd video, it's just,
yeah.
And it just makes you cry.
I think, Doug, it's interesting that I go from that realm on the continuum of prevention, right, to punishment. So there is, and whether it's someone who's robbing, someone who's murdering, and whether they're wearing a badge or not. So part of it is that all the training that needs to happen in this case for these police officers, right? From the gentleman in Fairfax County just over the weekend to the folks in Buffalo to the gentleman who killed Mr. Floyd, that there's training on the front end, but then there's also punishment, and the people need to know that the accountability will be swift and will be kind of certain on that. And so, yes, one of the operational policies is, for example, having the body-worn camera, right? But folks are talking about the fact that what was so chilling in the killing of Mr. Floyd and even these other cases, people know, these cops know they're being recorded, right? So it's not like they don't know they're being recorded. They know they're being recorded. And particularly after killing Mr. Floyd, you're like, wait, everyone's on edge. Everyone's watching the cops. And to still do it means you don't give a damn, right? I don't care what you're going to do, right? So it either means your life means nothing. I don't care about your life either way. Or you think I'm above that. They're not going to get me. Think about Rodney King. Who did time in the Rodney King case, right? And so it is this Freddie Gray. Who did time in the Freddie Gray case, right? So when people know, I don't really care about your life, it's not valuable, you can film me. I'm going to get off. I'm going to get off because of the jury. I'm going to get off because my union's got my back. I'm going to get whatever it may be. So I do think when we talk about the notion of like the reforms in the system are so multiple, right? People got to vote so you're in the jury pool so you can be in the jury and make sure that, reasonable voices are there, addressing things like the qualified immunity. There are all kinds of moving pieces that have to take place so that everywhere, hopefully, we create this web of goodness. So that when I'm sitting around in the locker room, my boy is like, yeah, did you see how I jacked that dude up and nothing's going to happen? Someone's got to say, no, that's not right. That's not how we're rolling today. But when I go into the courtroom, I know that the jury is going to actually be looking at the facts and coming with a sound reason. And then I also know that the policies in place at my place of employment are such that I can be held to account. When we've seen so many of these cases too, where it's so long for the charges, right, to be filed, right? That is more of an operational, and again, to me, it's a combination of operational and spiritual. Like there's got to be a policy that you move within a certain amount of time when people are like, oh, they had that video, but the departments didn't move on it until someone brought attention to it, right? So some of that is there may need to be operational policies in place that require, right, you move on certain things within a certain amount of time. But to me, again, it also goes in that spiritual realm where we have got to pray and educate and talk to people where we just fundamentally say that is unacceptable behavior. And I think that for people need to see themselves as having power, even at the very individual level. We saw that with the killing of Mr. Floyd, right? And I talked about this in the piece that I wrote, When Leaders Don't. Yes, one of the other cops said to the other cop, hey, shouldn't we turn him over? Right? But it should have gone beyond that, right? Should have insisted, no, I'm going to move to turn him over, right? Again, in the locker room, the power of locker room talk, the power of talk in our bedrooms, in our kitchen tables, our union hall meetings, at our, boardrooms, those kind of conversations is where a lot of us get the cues of whether our behavior is okay or not, whether it will be accepted, condoned, even applauded at times. Right. And so that's where this combination, I think, of legal frameworks to say this is illegal or illegal, the operational and the spiritual all has to converge so that we set new standards of expectations of behavior.
So we saw something good a few days after the Floyd murder. where there was, I don't remember what city this was in, but there was video of police wrestling a protester to the ground, an officer putting the knee on the neck of this person, and other officer just slapping it away, just saying, get off. I wonder how that officer was treated afterwards in terms of pushing it away or putting it on. Who was seen as the bigger problem there? I don't know.
Yeah.
So you mentioned some legal, some policy changes you'd like to see. Anything else you'd like to add to that in terms of where else we need to go with the spirit of the legal and the policy changes?
Yeah, I would say in the legal realm, it's interesting that a couple of things come to mind for me in the legal box that we need to keep in mind. One is that the legal fight takes place in both the courtroom and at the ballot box, which is clear, right? So the courts are going to interpret laws and rule on the legal questions. The elected legislative bodies, whether at the congressional level or a city council, are the ones who are actually making laws. So we have to all keep in mind, this is why it's so important to register, to actually vote in thoughtful and informed ways for folks that we think will advance the cause of anti-racism, deconstructing racism, making for more equity and justice in our country. So whether it's from an ANC commissioner in DC, a county clerk, a district attorney, judge, mayor, governor, congressional reps, president, at every level, we have to get involved. And when people talk about not voting or not voting in informed ways, they need to be checked on that. What's interesting to me is there's so many different things that, and we won't go through the laundry list, but if everything from a no-choke law, and we see some of that taking place now, conversations by governments talking about no-choke laws, removing the qualified immunity, right, is one of the things. Strengthening the Community Reinvestment Act, right? There are some final rules just came out on that, but maybe the FDIC will push that, will help create more investment, right, in communities that have typically been disinvested in. Inclusionary housing laws, tenant opportunity to purchase laws, creating housing trust funds, like in Baltimore City that just happened in the last couple of years. Some groups made a push on that. Continued expansion of healthcare, right? When the Obamacare, law, quote unquote, Obamacare got passed, but the fundamental notion of, are we trying to expand access to good healthcare? Well, there's a legal infrastructure that has to go with that, right? And so when people now with COVID are like, oh my gosh, right? Clutch pearls, we didn't know it was so bad. Well, it's been this bad for a long time, right? And so when people are having the debates around, right, are we going to put in place an infrastructure legally to make sure that all Americans have access to quality, affordable health care, right? So all of that, to the education funding. How do we fund education? Is it tied to the property taxes or not? And the debates that happen there. So there are a number of different ways, obviously, in various buckets where people can lean in, but I think people should be examining, if I'm trying to break down racism, the effects of racism, the legacies of racism, what are laws, big and small, in different buckets, health, education, wealth, right, criminal justice reform, that we need to attack? And it's a range of them, and everyone can't attack everything. So people can find where they lean in, make sure they're connected to groups that are connecting the dots, and go there, I think is a critical thing in terms as we look at the legal policy infrastructure.
So if we could, I'd like to turn to some questions from the audience. Ricarda Ganjam has said, how would you like to see LGW advance the conversation and actions in the region, and what role can corporations take to support individual employees at this time?
Yeah, so let me actually go in reverse order. Thank you for that question. So I think companies can support employees in a couple of ways. One is just providing, honestly, space for these kinds of conversations. I have been, Doug, amazed in the last couple of weeks at where in work meetings and work settings, the floor has been kind of open. People are like, look, the agenda for the day is, how are you doing? How are you feeling? What do we need to do? And the way in which so many people are really going through and struggling on personal levels, there's a lot of pain, a lot of angst. And so one is employers can make space for some of these kinds of conversations. But the second thing is, in some ways, that is a salve on the outside, right? That helps to kind of tamp down, helps a little bit of pain. But the lasting change, I think companies can look at things like, what can you do to bring lasting change and equity? So who gets hired? Who gets promoted? Where do you invest your money? Where do you spend your money? Does your company have targets for the hiring, retaining, and promotion of African Americans at all levels and on your boards? Do you have targets for how much of your money you will invest and spend with Black-owned companies? From the landscaping to the lawyers, banks to the food services, are there targets, incentives, and penalties? I just sent a note to the NFL Players Association and different players, suggesting that there could be a work stoppage. Players ought to consider a work stoppage until the NFL creates targets and systems to get to those targets for Black coaches in the NFL, right? So if you really want to help people at a time like this, help Black people who are struggling with like this racism, take concrete steps, right, to strengthen, right, and invest in the development, retention of Blacks at all levels, and where you put your money, I think are real examples. And I think for LGW, you're part of the question about what can LGW do. I think this series of conversations, I want to salute LGW for having it. Thanks, and I'm humbled for being a part of it. Continuing to have conversations like this, but actually to the question that was asked here by the person, LGW's got folks intentionally from all walks, right? So facilitating specific conversations that can lead to action around what is a local government? What is a nonprofit organization? What are foundations? What are for-profit businesses doing specifically? And how can they work together? When it comes to foundations and philanthropy and government, there's been a lot of talk about racial equity lenses. And I said, there are a lot of folks who are getting paid actually a lot of money to come with a lot of fancy language. Here's how I break it down. What community is being impacted? Are they Black and brown? Do those residents have any meaningful voice into input into the policies and decisions in the programming? Who runs the program that's getting funded to do the work, service work or development work? And then who gets paid in the supply chain? You answer those basic questions, that'll tell you whether or not you're moving towards racial equity or not. So I think for LGW, facilitating those kinds of conversations with companies, with foundations, with nonprofits, with governments could be a very helpful step.
So we've got another question, is opening the floor by people who are not trained to deal with discussions on race safe for the people sharing, particularly people of color?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I've experienced that actually in a couple of conversations that I've been called on to facilitate just in the last couple of weeks. And it was interesting because at one point in some of the conversations, there were white people generally weren't speaking, and African Americans voiced, "Hey, why aren't you talking?" And you had whites who would say, "I didn't think it was my place to speak," right? And so that dynamic of who. And so what I've said to folks is that we need to explicitly send the cue. It's okay for everyone to speak. We don't want anyone to dominate this conversation, if you would, but everyone has voice, but they're young people I work with, and we work on presentation skills. What I give oftentimes little surprise money to is for this. Well, I always do this. Good leaders, more than talk, they have to listen, right? Effective leaders have to listen. So creating a space and an expectation that says, look, we all have voice. If you have opinion, we need to hear it. But we also need to make sure everyone is listening and listening hopefully if we start with the premise and ask that question, are we trying to be well here, right? Are we trying to get better individually and corporately and collectively, whatever that organization is? That's what leadership is about. So if we have one of these conversations where only the white folks are talking, we've done wrong. But if we have a conversation where only the Black folks are talking, I also think personally we've done wrong. Yes, whites need to do specific things to change the impacts of white-led racism, anti-Black racism in this country. But there are times when we're all together. If we're all together, that we should all be able to talk, listen, and dialogue.
So Chris Stacy is asking, what leadership organizations for young people of color do you think are doing excellent work and could use financial support?
Great question. I happen to be a member of the 100 Black Men of Greater Washington, so I'll just say off the top that we have done work around training young men our Saturday Leadership Academy and STEM academies, where we do work with young Black men to help strengthen them. But I know there are other organizations out there, and we can certainly get a list, I think, to folks and kind of post and email it out, almost kind of put together a list of some of the groups that are doing work with young Black men. I know Concerned Black Men has been out there for years doing some things, and there are others. So I know the folks over at the Peaceaholics for years, when they were together, did a lot of work. They've kind of taken on a new form and are engaging in different ways. My classmate in LGW, Mary, was with a group, Life Pieces to Masterpieces, I know was doing good work out there as well. So it's a range of different groups. And again, we can certainly get folks some information, but I think finding those groups and plugging in, and sometimes with your money, but also to your time. Right? Sometimes the ability to be in dialogue, and everyone's not always going to be able to do that, but sometimes your time is as important, your voice and your ear can be as important in engaging with these young folks of color as your dollars.
So we've got a question from Karen Shine from Chicago. What are your suggestions for those of us trying to put programs in place for young people to gently address these personal issues without being heavy-handed?
So for me, it is, and I've actually learned this in some of the mentoring work I've done over the years, that, you know, there's time for what I call sometimes you got to pull somebody up by the neck. So it's, you know, it's like you got to kind of grab a kid by the shoulder, put a foot, and be like, look, doc, you need to tighten up. But a lot of times they also need a hug. They need an embrace. And it's a combination, right, of the things. And the notion of not being judgmental. I do come from an age where my folks put a belt to my behind, so I'm not so new school that I'm like, you know, that. But so I've come from that experience. But a lot of times, that was only a few times. The lessons I learned from my parents were when it was conversation, modeling the behavior, but also conversations about what do you want to be. What do you want to accomplish? Not your mom, not your dad, not we as mentors. What are your aspirations and dreams? Now let's talk about how you get there. What's going to help you advance? What are the things that are going to actually become stumbling blocks for you? And working with young people to help them identify what their vision and dreams are, whether it's grades they get, whether it's programs they'll participate in, sports or other extracurricular activities, where they want to go, and helping them realize when you did this, what happened? Did that help you advance towards your goal? Not so much? Okay, well then let's revisit that then. How about if you try this? Let's see if that helps you towards your goal. Have found that to be more effective over time on this. And I've learned that the hard way, because I've been mentoring Doug for 30 years. I started mentoring second year of college, and have been doing it ever since, and for the last 25 years as a founding member of the 100 Black Men of DC. And there was more of that heavy hand in the early days, and now it's a little different approach. It's a different generation of folks. Again, I think there's still time for when you got to say, look, doc, you got to really tighten up, but more of it is a give and take, and tapping into their aspirations and helping them see the consequence, for better or for worse, of their actions.
We got a comment from Faye Coleman in sort of response to the question about organizations helping young people. Don't forget organizations that focus primarily on girls and young women of color from underserved communities, such as Women of the Dream, or Indeed We Code, as well as many others. So Faye, thank you very much for that. We've got a question now about this is from Bernard Wright. What would be your charge for us as Black people in America to be prepared to exploit the opportunities that will present themselves as those interventions begin to bear fruit? So there's some opportunities hopefully arising for people as we try to make our country anti-racist. And do you have any advice for that?
Yeah, I think that we have to prepare ourselves to know, again, to the notion of where are we trying to go? What are we trying to do? What are we trying to be, right? And to think strategically, to have kind of game plans in place about in the realm of educational attainment, in our health, in our wealth, in our creativity, in the arts, whatever it may be, we should be thinking constantly, regardless of what the moment is, but certainly in this moment, to the point of the question of where are we trying to go? What are we trying to be? And to be strategic in lining up kind of the game plan for getting there. And then we also have to be prepared in terms of knowing the material, if you would, as my parents used to say to me, you got to know your stuff. And so we have to be ready to act as you know, when the coach puts you in the game, you got to be ready to play. And so we have to be ready to play in terms of doing the study, doing the due diligence, having our systems in place so that we are able to move and move effectively. And then the other part of this is having honest conversation. And we should all do this, black, white, blue, or green. But being honest that everyone is not equipped. I always say everyone who cares, a lot of folks who care can't, and those who can don't care. And so just because someone looks like us, just because they got a big heart, doesn't mean they're supposed to get the contract. Doesn't mean they're supposed to be the one who's out front. Sometimes they just don't have the skill set, right? And so maybe we coach them up and help them get better. But we can't let ineffective folks or shady folks be the ones who are out front, and just because they are quote unquote, they look like us, or they're activists, or you know, they're the black vendor, we have to hold ourselves to account. I always say to people that, to me, one of the beauties of good and evil, of intelligence and incompetence, are that they are universal. No group of people has a monopoly on any of that. So we've got brilliance and we've got ignorance. We've got folks who are good and we got folks who are evil. When our folks are good, let's applaud them. When they're doing wrong, we need to tighten them up. If they can be coached up, nurtured up, whatever, let's do that. But when they're not, we got to call to account, because if we don't, we know that we have less leeway. And so that's a big part of it as well. And I do think, to that point, Doug, I just want to mention that as it relates to like what opportunities may come. And this goes to, I think there's more and more conversation that's been going on. The push for reparations in this country has been discussed for years. Mr. Conyers on the Hill, HR 40 had been talked about. Ta-Nehisi Coates a few years ago, bringing up kind of the case for that. So it kind of caught more attention. Sheila Jackson Lee has been talking about that, the Congresswoman. I do think there's going to be Andy Shalal here in DC, ran an op-ed not long ago about that. We've been having some conversations with partners about what might that look like after we at Enterprise brought the Undesigned, the Red Line exhibit here to the area, to Baltimore and DC and Columbia, Maryland, having conversations with that. So the notion of really grounding some conversation in a real way around reparations and what that looks like, that conversation about what resources may flow to a community and the preparedness to accept it, deal with it, are going to be real. But I do, and last thing on this, and then I'll pause, which is, but I think we can't fall into the trap of, well, are you prepared to get it, right? The money, so to speak, if you're talking about repairing, because Black folks, again, are no different than white folks, Asian folks, Latino folks, which is sometimes we're going to get it right, sometimes we're going to get it wrong. Sometimes we'll be successful with it, and sometimes we won't. But when things are being kind of provided to make amends for a wrong that was done, right now, my preparedness should have nothing to do with that. If you did the crime, right, in this case, you got to make amends. And so making amends should not in any way, right, be factored. You don't factor into my moral or mental readiness to receive, right, the amends that you're going to make as the offending party.
So I want to get into what we can do to help, what we can do to make a difference. You sent us a list of things. Before we put that up on the screen, though, I do have a comment from Angela Hackley, who loves the Trouble Funk poster in the background.
Oh, TROUBLE flat boogie, Angela. Okay, that's all I'm going to say on that.
So Chase, if you could put up the list that David says. Dave, you want to just talk about it a little bit of things we can do to help, and just
sure, yeah.
And we'll share this with people. We'll send this out to everybody who is on the call.
I have gotten a number of questions from folks who've been calling and asking, hey, what can I do? What can I do? I don't pretend to have all the answers. And there are a lot of groups who have their plans, but this is just a sample list of a range of things that folks can think about. And it starts at a very personal level, right? Pray for the nation, right? To repent, have conversations with friends and family about what they can do, and challenge racist assumptions and actions. I've talked to several white friends and colleagues who have talked about, because one of the questions we ask is, how are you feeling? What are you currently doing to address it? What more can you do? And then what more do you think we can do? That's how I've kind of framed some of these conversations with people in the last couple of weeks. And it's been interesting to hear several white friends talk about, just with family gatherings, I've had these conversations with folks about, what's wrong, what do we need to do, and challenging some of the assumptions that folks have there. I had a friend send me a note, because I've been asking folks, right? People who've asked me what they can do. I've asked them, what do you think you can do? What are you doing in addition? And somebody wrote back, a white friend of mine wrote back and said, folks ought to just have whites and blacks invite each other to their homes just to break bread and get to know each other. So just interesting thing. I already talked about some of the workplace stuff, the notion about anti-racism and anti-bias, the education and training. And so talked about that. The qualified immunity, we talked about that for the cops, the body-worn cameras. If you see number 7, this notion of setting targets and the systems that I talked about that earlier to really expand the pool of blacks at boards and as employees, companies and governments. I think these couple are really important. Number 8, number 9, number 10, this notion of setting goals and systems to increase the use of Black-owned businesses is important. The HR 40, the commission to study and make recommendations about reparations. I think we need that at the federal level and at local levels. And we're going to be having conversations with some folks in local government here in DC and Baltimore about that. Create action plans to eliminate the gaps. So again, in the midst of coronavirus, a lot of folks have been saying, oh my gosh, it's revealed these gaps these equity gaps between blacks and whites. And so it's like, okay, a lot of us know that was there for a long time, but hey, if the lights just, that's great. But let's go beyond the barbershop conversation, or as a colleague of ours in the industry likes to say, don't just celebrate the problem. So we know that problem is there. We know we have equity gaps in housing. We know we have equity gaps in health. A lot of folks are running around talking about the Raj Chetty study, your zip code determining how long you live and the outcome of your life. Okay, great, we know all that. Now, so what, now what? That's what I've been asking. So what, now what? What is our plan to reduce those equity gaps? I think is critical. So governments ought to have that in place and the like. And there's some other things in here about CRA, increasing support for land trust, and like some of these are housing specific and how they tie into wealth. How do we increase home ownership for African Americans? How do we increase opportunities for tenants who are in rental situations to potentially go into more ownership, cooperative ownership type pieces? And the last one, Doug, number 15 is close to my heart. I put this in here, and I just want to spend a minute on this because this is critical around the peace room. Structures to institutionalize work to end murder in your jurisdiction, requiring performance benchmarks for all agencies related to prevention of homicide. You noted at the beginning when you introduced me, I started the No Murders DC movement in 2000. The goal was to end murder in the city. And one of our guiding principles was one murder is one murder too many. Resources to end murder in the city exist in the city. And every time a homicide happens, we say the city ought to kind of collectively stop, not just government, but all of us should stop and say, what went wrong? How do we keep this from happening again? And one of the things we said is that until all life is valued, none of these lives really matter. And so when we say that Black lives matter, I live in a city that was 70% Black, now is 47% Black. I live in a city where since the year 2000, over 3,400 people have been killed. Let me say that again. I live in a city, Washington, D.C., where since 2000, over 3,400 people have been murdered on the streets of Washington, D.C. since the year 2000. The homicide rate has doubled in the last 8 years. While numbers have gone down generally in the country, the numbers have doubled in the last 8 years in Washington, D.C. Roughly 90% or so of the perpetrators and the victims are Black men. So if we are going to say that Black lives matter, if we are going to say that Black folks should be valued, then we can't allow any of us all of this murder to happen, and we just keep on with business as usual. There was a New York Times reporter who tragically died after he was robbed, and the EMS came in, and there were questions about how effective or not the EMS was. Mr. Rosenberg and his family threatened to sue the city government unless they did structural reforms to how things responded. And what I say is good for them. That's what they ought to do. But literally, there were structural changes made in government to make sure that that wouldn't happen again. Meanwhile, 3,400 plus people have died. The overwhelming majority of them are Black and Black men, like Mr. Floyd, like Eric Garner, look just like them. And yet we don't have the outcry, and more than the outcry, we don't have the systems in place. Doug, when Anthony Williams was mayor back in the early 2000s, we went to talk to him at No Murders DC. We didn't ask for a dime. What we did ask for were performance benchmarks for every city agency related to the prevention of homicide. Movements, and this goes back to the question you asked earlier, movements have to become, we would say, religious language incarnate in the people. In other words, corporate language, it has to be institutionalized to show whether or not this work would go away. I'm on a task force now, homicide prevention task force in DC, the mayor and the city council named members. City council members asked questions of some of the agencies that they have oversight for, Parks and Rec, the school system, not the police, Parks and Rec, school system, and others. Every city agency ought to be thinking about how do we make sure people don't get killed in our city so that that work becomes institutionalized. When I saw that questions about KPIs related to homicide were being asked in 2020, when we first asked that question in like 2002, 18 years of pushing for this. Sometimes you got to do that work behind the scenes. Moms demand action, and No Murders are now pushing for like a peace room, a place where we coordinate the response across agencies and with public and private sector in the District of Columbia to make sure that homicides do not happen. That needs to be baked into the way. So the same way we know a fire department is going to be there, a police department is going to be there, we need to have this kind of peace room with a czar-like function to do this kind of work so that Black men don't keep getting murdered. So whether it's at the hands of a police officer or another Black person, it's still a dead Black man, a dead Black woman that's happened. I get the difference of the nuance of when it happens at the hands of the government, those entrusted with the power of the state, that there is a different dynamic. I'm clear on that, period, next sentence. But at the end of the day, there have been 3,000 or so Black folk killed in this city. There needs to be a push to institutionalize that work. So long after murals are painted on the street, long after protesters have gone, we know that the Parks and Rec, the police department, fire department, Department of Public Works are thinking, what do we need to do to prevent this homicide? It's the same thing for companies. If you care about attacking Black racism, right, then you as a company, you as a government, you as a foundation need to institutionalize that work and make sure there's going to be accountability long after you as a CEO or the secretary or receptionist are there and are long gone. That work has to be baked into with annual accountability where people know they're going to be measured for the steps taken to address racism in any of its forms and effects. So that would be my kind of parting word to folks on that.
Let me just add one thought to that. So in the sniper shootings in 2002, these snipers came in and killed 10 people in the region over a period of 3 weeks. 9 other people were killed in everyday violence in the same counties in the same time period. The whole world watched as we worked to catch the snipers, and we caught them. And then the next day, the press and everybody vanished because I think Senator Wellstone died in a plane crash, and that was the new hot story. And they caught the snipers, so let's move on. Nobody cared about these other 9 people who were killed in everyday violence, and that sort of goes on and on and on, as you said. And we actually had a thought leadership series this year with Mark Miguel and a wider circle on how do we end this sort of systemic violence in our region and make our neighborhood safer? How do we get more economic opportunity to help give people options to resorting to violence or to resorting to a different kind of life? So
yep.
let me just ask, any LGW members that have helped you in the last couple of months? Anybody who's reached out to you and said, what can we do?
Yeah, you know, in the lab, it's interesting. There's some folks that I work with who it seems like I run into. It's almost hard to answer the question because there's so many LGW members, literally, in my day to day work. So, as they say, you know, tell preachers don't start calling names because you'll leave someone out and get them upset. So the short answer is yes. The longer answer is it's been a range of folks. So in my day job working for housing affordability, there have been folks who have reached out and who I work with kind of day to day, if you would, in the industry, who are working around this equity piece, who are working to, there are series going on with groups that are putting, you know, racial equity education series, putting racism on the table series, looking at operationalizing groups doing that kind of work. We're led by LGW folks. There are people who are working to think about how to restructure the approach to investing. And so, you know, they're thinking about that. Since George Floyd got killed, there are folks who have reached out not only yet to say, how are you doing? How's the No Murders DC work going, and a range of things. So I would say that, yes, LGW is great at that in terms of that network. And to that question that was asked earlier, I'm hoping that, again, this series is a great piece of this, and that LGW will continue to think about how the network of all these members around this region can come together kind of in intentional ways to make the linkages and have explicit conversations about how do we deconstruct racism, how do we address the impacts of racism, and really get specific with it. And I think in some ways, if people saw that list and were willing to raise their hand and saying, you know, here's what I'm willing to do, here's what I commit to do, as an individual or as a company. And Doug, real good example, I got an email over the weekend from a friend of mine, a white friend of mine, who reached out and said that her family was driving and realized that there's an ice cream shop in their neighborhood that is Black owned. So she said, one of the things I'm going to do is from now on, when we buy our ice cream, we're going to go there. Now, in some ways, that's a small thing, right? But it's a meaningful thing, and it's a thing. And I always tell people, you don't build a wall all at once. It's one brick at a time, right? You got to put one brick at a time on that wall. And so sometimes you may have in your circles of influence, we all have circles of influence, right? So that's a very personal circle of influence. Where am I going to spend my ice cream money today? But that person may also, some people may have the ability to make, again, policy changes in government, policy changes in boardrooms, policy changes amongst your friends, not policy, but kind of cultural norm changes amongst the friends that you talk to. What's okay, what's not okay. And that's how we get to, it's a both and, right? To get to the deconstruction of something and the building up of something good and better will require everything from where do you buy your ice cream to who do you do your business with and invest your money, and everything. And when do you say, we have to turn that man over? We have to turn that man over, right? From that cop, I so wish, and I heard, and I don't know if this is true or not, but I heard that the cop who asked, you know, shouldn't we turn him over? He needs to be turned over, was a rookie who was in training. I don't know if that's true or not, but, you know, literally, Mr. Floyd may be alive now if he had been able to push a little harder, lead a little stronger. So there are various ways in which, and that's why I wrote in my piece, when leaders don't, whether it's from the White House to when you're in a moment like that where a gentleman's being arrested, right? When that cop came up yesterday or over the weekend in Fairfax County and tased that man twice, what if some of the other professionals who were already on the scene, who were trying to de-escalate the situation, what if they had literally kind of gone and intervened? Hey, no, guy. I always say there's a whole lot more buffalo than there are the lions who hunt them, right? But the reason that the lions went out and get them is because when they charge, the buffaloes scramble, right? They scatter. And so now it's like, I'm gonna pick off the weakest. What we need is the buffalo to be buffalo soldiers, right? Turn around and say, no, we are not gonna have this. And we've seen this with the protesters, right? When the president tried to bully, right, push them out, okay, next day what'd they do? They came back stronger, came back deeper. We're gonna sit right here. That's the kind of approach we take. And again, whether it's in your boardroom or somewhere else, there's more of us than them, and we have to speak out. I promise this will be the last thing I'll say. When I started at Enterprise, I was maybe about a year in, and the chief operating officer at our company at the time was a Black woman, and she was leaving. She was going to be leaving, and it was going to be replaced. And our leader at the time, Bart Harvey, a white male, blue blood, through and through, and I was a new guy, rookie amongst market directors. And I'll never forget, I said to Bart, Bart, listen, all due respect, I think the board ought to, assuming all other things being equal, qualified and all of that, we need to find a Black person in general and another Black woman in particular to hire into this position. It was crickets in the room, right? Well, afterwards, a number of people came to me outside privately. Hey, man, glad you said that. Glad you said that. Well, that's nice, right? But one, it was a call for me to speak my truth at that moment. I thought that's what we needed to do. And even though I was a rookie, and even though I'm saying that to a blue blood white male, that was something I thought needed to be said. But also, and so there's no consequence or anything. But I wish that the people who came up to me afterwards and said, way to go, had said that in the room, right? Because then it sets that tone of this is what we all expect. And so we have to do that again, from boardrooms to street corners. I don't care if you're a rapper in a booth, in a board, courtroom, faith leader, whatever it is, that's how we change this thing for the long term.
So David, thank you very much for this very thoughtful conversation. Really appreciate it. You've given us a lot to think about. You've given us a lot to act on. We will send out a video recording of this conversation to everyone on the call, and we'll send out David's list of action items that we can do for people to take a look at and to check off some of the items to do.
Hey, Doug, real quick. I don't normally do shout outs, but I did see Anta James, who is in Africa, who used to be a Kaiser Permanente. I see her in the chat room, so I got to give love to Anta James, coming all the way from Africa. We miss you, Anta, so glad you're plugged in. God bless you. Doug, thank you all at LGW, and God bless everyone. Stay faithful in the work. Stay faithful in the work. Stay faithful in the work.
Thank you, David. We'll talk to you soon. Thanks, everybody.